Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jess Lenore in Baltimore. A week after a Nazi sympathizer killed Heather Heyer and injured dozens more in Charlottesville, Virginia, tens of thousands marched across the country to oppose white supremacy. 40,000 people in Boston protested a so-called free speech rally featuring right-wing speakers on Saturday. In historic Boston Common Park alone, hundreds of protesters who believe the event could become a platform for racist propaganda dwarfed the few dozen rally participants. More cities have joined in taking down their Confederate statues, including Baltimore, where a statue of Christopher Columbus was defaced over the weekend.
Part of our evolution as humans requires tearing down monuments to destructive forces and tearing down systems that maintain them.
And a tent city protest demanding a $2 billion equity fund has entered its second week. Now joining us to discuss all of this and more is Glenn Ford. He's the executive editor at Black Agenda Report and a frequent contributor here at The Real News. Thank you so much for joining us, Glenn.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to get your thoughts on this week of development since Charlottesville. We know Trump defended the attendees of the rally. He said, they're not all bad, they're not all neo-Nazis, they're not all white supremacists. And a week later, tens of thousands showed up in Boston and other cities over the weekend to, say that this is not acceptable and to really oppose white nationalism. We know Steve Bannon, one of Trump's leading, his chief strategist and a leading white nationalist, has gone back to Breitbart News just on Friday. So give us your thoughts about this, these interesting developments happening. It's all centered around these Confederate statues, hundreds of them, which are still up across this country.
Well, what's going on is a massive educational exercise, and that's what happens when you have a real movement or a movement that is in the making. The nation is having to face, because of these dramatic developments, some of them tragic, some of them great celebrations, the nation is having to face the fact that the United States was born as a white settler colony and then as a white settler state. And much of that character continues to be the case for the United States. But there's another aspect here, another part of the conversation, which is rather new, and that is the talk about fascism. And I think we're having that talk about fascism, especially because Donald Trump is in office. But this conversation about fascism usually consists more in name-calling than in analysis. And I think the education that the United States public, the next part of the curriculum that they're going to have to be subjected to, is the fact that the United States was a model for European fascists, and that forms of fascism in the United States predate the European model, as James Q. Whitman's recent book, Hitler's Model, explains. So I think we're going to get deeper into an analysis of the real workings of the U.S. political economy, more than just a discussion of simplistic ideas about white supremacy as this educational exercise continues.
And speaking of Europe, I saw Ta-Nehisi Coates make this point in the last few days that in Europe, the Nazis were defeated, but, they took the statues down of Hitler and of Nazis. And, the Nazi flag is illegal in Germany. Here, there's hundreds of Confederate statues. The Confederate flag, has been a symbol in states' flags all across the South and are only recently being removed. And I think in Mississippi it still exists there. So that is another comparison to Europe as well.
Well, in Europe, one of the reasons that Nazis in Europe fly the Confederate flag is because they can't fly the Nazi flag. And so in Ukraine, for example, that fascist regime that the United States had such a hand in initiating in Ukraine, its backers were awash in Confederate flags. So the Europeans know that the Confederate flag stands for a white supremacist system that is very much like what they understand to be fascism. You know, the U.S. South, after the crushing of Reconstruction, with the invention of Jim Crow, created out of whole cloth the modern world's first totally regimented racial society, from the cradle to the grave. That was the model that Hitler so admired. And that society was in full effect for 80 or 90 years, for 4 or 5 generations. And the North did not defeat or ostracize that society. It reconciled with it. And that was part of the American saga, that this civil war, or war between brothers, they called it, finally ended with reconciliation among the brothers over the bodies of dead Black folks with the crushing of Reconstruction. And after the second Reconstruction, as some people call it, in the 1960s, what did the nation as a whole do? Not just the South, but the entire country, in lightning speed, imposed a new regime, a new Jim Crow of mass Black incarceration, which tells you that those two halves of the country really had reconciled, and they reconciled along the lines of white supremacy.
And it's always important to note when we're having these discussions that it was during Jim Crow, it was during the Civil Rights Movement when these Confederate monuments were erected across the country. The vast majority were. They weren't erected after the Civil War, so really, it's really hard to argue they're not symbols of white supremacy. You know, they are, and they're not symbols of even of the war. It's this new this lost cause myth. It's white terror that's inflicted on the Black population of this country that they really represent. And I wanted to take this conversation to today because white supremacy, and you're talking about the policies that were implemented under Jim Crow and throughout the 20th century, you know, these are things that are still in effect, that especially Black people are still feeling the consequences of, especially in Baltimore. And that's why for the last week, there's been a tent city in Baltimore. They have a list of demands for a $2 billion equity fund, which include things like money for lead abatement, violence prevention, the end of food deserts to help eliminate transit and biking deserts, to have job training, job creation, to have homes created and built for populations that have been denied access to housing. And it was actually during the eclipse in Baltimore that I went in front of City Hall to interview some of the people taking part in this homeless encampment. They've been there for over a week. And actually, I was filming these you know, city employees, these corporate employees in front of City Hall. They had their backs turned to this homeless encampment that has been there for a week. And the mayor's already said she's not going to meet with the people that are camped there. And I spoke to a young man named Dominic, who was 31 years old. He spent the majority of his adult life either homeless or in prison. And this is what he told me.
Dominic, I've been out here since July of last year, off and on. In January, I got into treatment, graduated in June, and ended up back down here because I didn't want transitional housing. You know, I don't really necessarily want to share no place with nobody or nothing like that. After being displaced and being homeless, you know, I'm dealing with people and stuff, but it's not too easy to deal with too many people, living with people after, you know, over the years being locked up back and forth and stuff like that. But yeah, I've been down here since July last year, but since July this year, I've been sleeping in the tent downtown this summer. And I've been here for about a week at Memorial Plaza. But I dealt with being homeless ever since I was 19, off and on, 31. But recently I became homeless because I needed a job. You know, I was working a job and come find out it was a work program, not an actual job. So, like, That's one of the demands that we have. We don't want housing programs. We want housing. You know, we don't need a program. We need housing. We need jobs.
Glenn, essentially what people in Baltimore and across the country are calling for is not just what the liberal media has described. They're not just calling for the end of these symbols. They're calling for new policy that replaces the white supremacy that exists in public policy across the country. What's your response?
Well, that's very, very encouraging. You know, this Jim Crow, this white supremacist system was a full political economy with vast ramifications. I think that the activists today don't want to find themselves in the same position as the Black Lives Matter young folks in their encounter with Hillary Clinton a couple of years ago, where they had no agenda and asked only that the would-be president feel their pain. No, these activists are going in with a program that addresses real material concerns.
And finally, they're not also going to Trump, who, I mean, there's almost no point making these demands to Trump. But in Baltimore, they're going to what some have described is a neoliberal mayor. She vetoed the minimum wage, $15 minimum wage here earlier this year. There was a fight over the city council. She wanted to cut after-school programs. The city council said, no, we're going to cut police overtime to fund these after-school programs. She ran as a progressive, but and she's a Democrat. She's African-American, as is the majority of the city, as is a good amount of the political leadership here. But the people camped out, and their supporters say they're not representing the interests of the majority of this city here in Baltimore. Your response?
That's why we call them the Black misleadership class. And on a day-to-day level in most urban centers, the people who oppose Black folks' righteous demands are usually other Black people working for the Democratic Party. And I want to say this about demands. Demands are not just put forward so that those in power can review them and say yes or no. People put forward demands so that the folks, the masses of folks, can understand what those demands are, ratify them or change them, and make them their own. So the real constituency for the demands is certainly not the rulers, it's the people. And those demands can change as the people's consciousness changes.
All right, Glenn Ford, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.